GEICO kicks their cloud provider to the curb. Why'd they do that? Let's talk about it. So welcome back to the Cloud Computing Insider. This channel explores the ins and outs of cloud computing without an agenda or following into the narrative set by big tech marketing. We look at what works, what does not, and the actual value of this technology in a balanced and information-forward way. If that interests you, please subscribe, like, and comment. I'm your host, David Linthicum, author, speaker, B-List Geek. Let's get started. So this came from actually you guys, a listener out on LinkedIn. Recommended this story. I hadn't seen it, didn't come up in my feed, but it certainly is interesting. And this is GEICO's journey back. A 300 million cloud bill drives major infrastructure shifts. And it was first covered in the Stack, and it's there's a few other articles about it as well, and they're all linked in the description, so check those out if you're looking for a deeper dive. And by the way, that's where I got my information from. This was me not going out to GEICO and dealing with their PR folks and talking to the people and sussing the story out myself. I'm not a journalist, I'm a pundit. So this is me responding to other publications who covered the story. So GEICO, if you don't know, is an insurance company. I live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area where there's lots of government employees. I think it's government employee insurance company. I don't know what the O means. But they had the GEICO Caveman a few years ago, if you remember that kind of marketing campaign. They're a $40 billion Berkshire Hathaway company. Ultimately, all of this was covered in the Slack article. And if you're looking for more detail, I urge you to do your own research as to what they did. And again, my comment just isn't on the ins and outs of why GEICO did this. And even though we are going to go into the details in a very deep way, it's why they're doing it and what we can learn from their experiences. So this is they went from a $300 million cloud spending trigger point. So in other words, I think they were mad as hell. They couldn't take it anymore when their cloud spend went to $300 million. And then it triggered repatriation, which we'll talk about. So you got to keep in mind that people push back on the repatriation stuff when I talked about how 2023 and 2024 are going to be the years of repatriation. They say they don't see that many stories out there. Absolutely right, because most companies who are doing repatriation, and I worked on a lot of these projects myself, they're not going to publicly announce what they're doing. And so even if I'm a consultant for these companies, you sign NDAs, which means you can't take information you learn there, write about it, speak about it, things like that. So that's why you don't hear about it. And ones I think you do hear about, normally there are some other motivations at play as well. We saw the Dave Hansen company for last year in terms of his repatriation, and he made a big deal out of that, and it was great that he would expose it. And lots of other smaller plays, and this now GEICO. And so I can't comment on what's going on here, but normally there is some sort of trigger within the deal where they're going to get a massive discount, but they can't. But they have to announce the project. So it's, in other words, you need to go on the record. And I've worked these deals as CTO before. You're getting some marketing play out of some sort of a discount you're providing them, and so this could have been the case where they're offering them significant discounts to move back to on-prem with some sort of a vendor doing it, and they do have a core vendor that they're using for this repatriation, and they're doing it for their own reasons, which is fine. So based on my experience, thousands of these projects are occurring worldwide right now. They're either small, medium, large, like t-shirt size. I would call GEICO's a large, probably an extra large, but they're just starting to normalize their workloads and their data sets and migrating some of them back on-prem that probably never should have been in the cloud in the first place. And what's triggering that is this massive bill that they're seeing. And one of the things I am going to do is talk about the stages that I think a lot of companies are going through over the last 10 years in terms of their realizing that they have an issue and then triggering the repatriation stuff that we see today. So GEICO's cloud journey, or how they had a path to the public cloud, and they're a big public cloud user, just like a lot of insurance companies out there. I think you'll find that 30-40% of their workloads and data sets exist in the cloud now, if not more. So their initial cloud adoption occurred when everybody else was adopting cloud, beginning in 2013, so roughly 11 years ago. And the scale of operations, they had a presence across 8 different cloud providers, so they're a multi-cloud deployment. They had 200,000 cores of computing power, 30,000 instances of containers and VMs. 80% of their workloads were in the public cloud. That's massive, by the way. That's normally almost an unnatural number that we see out there. So they evidently made the push, probably had a cloud first thing, and probably made too much of an aggressive movement in the cloud. And of course, they had 600 plus applications were involved that existing in the cloud. So they were all in cloud, very much like a lot of companies I was dealing with at the time, cloud only, cloud this. We're going to move everything to the cloud. We're going to shut down our data centers, yada, yada, yada. And here we are in 2024 talking about how we're putting them back in the data centers, which is a common story right now. So the breaking point for GEICO, why they decided to repatriate, was the reason most people do, is cost factors. In other words, it wasn't not working in the cloud. Everything works on-prem and everything works in the cloud. It really is dependent on how much money you're willing to pay for it. And that's where they kind of... the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So they had a $300+ million annual cloud bill that they were paying for. Single provider accounted for $50 million. You can guess who that is out of the big three that are out there, the one that's most used. 2.5x increase in costs over time. And if you know, that's actually kind of cool because that aligns with what I talk about in my book, that people are paying normally. When they look at what they anticipated paying before they moved into the cloud and what they actually are paying, it's normally 2.5 times what was expected to be. So if they expected it to be, $1,000 for a particular workload per month, it ended up being, $2,500, which is pretty big range when you're an insurance company or you're a manufacturing company and your margins are very small. And the amount that you're able to allocate to IT is also going to be very small. And suddenly you have this resource, in this case, public cloud providers, that are eating up all your money. And so they had expensive storage and AI operations that they're starting to emerge in, and they just said, hey, this is enough. We're going to go ahead and move this stuff to a more economical, a more cost-efficient platform, which in their case was on-prem. And by the way, this could be another micro cloud or moving it to a colo provider. When you're talking about colo providers and managed service providers, functionally speaking, they're moving it back on-prem. They're just moving it back on hardware that they're maintaining their own hardware within a rented space within a data center space. And, it's DigitalOcean and a bunch of these colo providers are out there. They're able to provide these capabilities. In fact, I rarely see, and I wouldn't recommend that people would build their own data center space, but use a colo provider or sometimes a managed service provider if they're not going to use the cloud. So they had data spread across multiple vendors, integration complexities in making this happen. Obviously, complexity is the big thing here. They probably didn't anticipate the amount of native clouds that they had to work across. You have to pay the money to make all these systems work and play well together. And also there's data egress and ingress fees that have to be paid. And I'm sure that was a lot of their $300 million bill that they were getting every year. And they also viewed it as innovation limitations. So in other words, they couldn't be as innovative as they needed to be if they were using somebody else's equipment or somebody else's stuff, which is really what cloud providers are. I'd be interested to hear the details behind that. And by the way, if you work for GEICO and you're willing to come on the show, reach out to me. I'll get you on. Really it's just kind of a bunch of bad decisions that they made. And again, the assumption here, and just an assumption on my part, is they went through the mistakes that lots of other enterprises do. They just moved to cloud for the sheer emotion of it. In other words, everybody was moving everything to cloud first, and they looked at every workload as something they could move to the cloud. And you certainly could. You could pick it up. You could do a lift and shift, find an analog of the platform in the cloud provider you're moving to. Everything's going to work fine, but you get the bill. That's where the problem occurs. So this is not a incompatibility thing. This is not a technological limitations that the cloud providers put on them. This is cost thing. In other words, it cost them way more than they thought they would be paying. And if cloud providers aren't willing to significantly reduce their prices, and we talked about that on the show before, then it's fine. It's time to find alternatives, and that's what GEICO did. So what do they pick as their alternative? Well, they picked the Open Cloud Project, or OCP, which was a technical implementation. They had a partnership with Wiwynn. I guess it's a Chinese company. Adoption of AMD EPYC chipsets is part of it. So in other words, moving to a new chipset, implementation of ORV's rack specifications and moving to it. and use of open BMCs and Redfish for fleet management of those systems. So all in on moving to on-prem environments, and this particular vendor, this particular solution was what they picked. And I suspect that, I don't know, I suspect that part of their adoption was going to be making the announcement, which is why I'm reading it on the show, which is probably going to be hit 100,000 times. And so OCP is getting free press. GEICO, I think, is getting some positive press, even though I would be asking the question, why was it in the cloud in the first place if that was the wrong decision, if you're paying to fix it now. However, they view this as a net benefit for them, probably the discounts they're getting for making the announcements. So what was the final impact of moving it on-prem? 50% reduction in compute cost per core, 60% reduction in storage cost per gigabyte. Significant power efficiency improvements were made as well. And so this is what we're typically seeing in moving it back to on-prem. And what has occurred in the last 10 years is the cost of storage and the cost of compute that occurs on-prem, the cost of owning your own hardware has significantly come down in the last 10 years. I wouldn't say exactly a 45-degree angle, and obviously the prices are going to change, but it's fairly cheap to set up infrastructure on-prem, even if you use the major providers like IBM and HPE and Dell. And it's you're just going to have to run it yourself and pay for your own power. It becomes completely your problem, where cloud providers were able to, in essence, abstract you away from a lot of that stuff, since they were using them through the open internet or through some sort of a private connection. It was their issue to deal with storage, sometimes the BCDR stuff, things like that. Now it's on you, but normally the financial benefits, in this case, 50% reduction in compute costs, 60% reduction in storage costs, that's significant. So that's a reason to go ahead and absorb those risks of running this stuff on-prem. GEICO did the analysis, and it was clear that that was their best path. So what was their technical architecture, which is important? They use Kubernetes for compute provisioning, so containers and container orchestration, custom placement solutions for CAPI, CAPI, open source monitoring with Prometheus and Grafana, modular hardware design approach, which is what they picked. And so this is, pretty, I would say, is it off the shelf? Yeah, this is the way a lot of enterprises are building their solutions these days. Certainly, Kubernetes, container orchestration, use of containers is hugely popular out there. It's probably an overused architecture, just like we talked about the microservice stuff. And it has a tendency, however, to run up the costs. In other words, it uses more compute, it uses more storage capabilities, and I suspect that they may have run into that as a problem. In other words, when they started moving into cloud, they got these big cloud bills because they're running these big honking, container and container orchestration applications on the cloud, which is perfectly fine to do, but you're just going to have to pay for it. However, if you do run them on-prem with your own hardware, you're not going to get this power bill every month. In other words, you pay for the sunk cost of the hardware and to power it. And whether you use 50% of your infrastructure, 80% of your infrastructure, basically you're going to pay the same stuff. In other words, that's after the fixed cost has been made. And so that's the advantage of running on things on-prem. And that's why it's probably more cost effective for them. So some of the implementation challenges that GEICO told this author about, and he published it in his article, were supply chain constraints, probably getting some of the hardware they needed on time. Certainly during COVID, that was a problem that everybody was running into. Talent acquisition and retention, which is systemic to everything that's there. They couldn't find the people they needed if they're going to run it on-prem to monitor, do the core architecture, things like that. In fact, what I'm finding out is many of these companies are going back to some of their older employees and retraining them to put them back on what they were focused on 10 years ago. So in other words, someone was focused on-prem in terms of running things within a data center and running their own owned hardware. Then they moved them in the cloud and they retrained them for the cloud. And now they're retraining them to get them focused back on the new solution, which is going to be on-prem. So it was, some of the older employees are probably looking at a little bit of whiplash to what they're going through. Hardware software integration was obviously a challenge, and it's always going to be a challenge when you're dealing with stuff you own. You got to remember it's your problem. You're doing it. Even though you have a hardware provider and platform provider and software providers to help you, at the end of the day, it's your responsibility to get things up and running. and then some custom networking requirements, which were always going to be an issue. Again, we're not leveraging a network on demand like we're doing with cloud computing. This is ours. We have to maintain it. And I think they found that a bit challenging, which I don't find a surprise at all. So what I thought was interesting is that out of all the repatriation stuff that I'm seeing out there, they're starting to emerge with common patterns. In other words, there's a cloud journey lifecycle, and that I think we can, kind of tag and label now. And so stage one of that journey would be adoption, initial excitement about the cloud possibilities. And certainly this is between 2008 and 2015. Everybody was moving into cloud. Focus on agility and scalability as the battle cries were moving into cloud. And I think there's good reason to do that. Again, cloud is going to be an okay solution as long as you're doing so with the proper workloads. And but they turned this into a cultural thing where people were making the automatic decisions to move stuff in the cloud. I suspect there wasn't a lot of architecture involved, probably no understanding what the costs were going to be. And this was just kind of a lift and shift thing where they're lifting things, sticking in the cloud and kind of hoping for the best. And normally if these applications are not normalized or modernized, so they're able to leverage cloud resources efficiently, then you're going to get the big bills. And I suspect that's what's driving this. And they may have looked at going off and modernizing the applications as an alternative to repatriation, but realized that probably it could have been cost prohibitive and added more risk than they wanted to deal with, and the easiest path of least resistance was to move them back on-prem. Stage two would be the growth, rapid expansion of cloud services, multiple provider adoption, increased workload migration. So this is all in for cloud. We're training people on cloud computing. This is our way moving forward that probably, was something discussed even at the boardroom. And everybody was very excited about using cloud, and they were starting to hit the accelerator and getting the migration factories up and running and moving their data and workloads to the cloud. Stage three is when you see the cost realization. So in other words, a growing awareness of cloud expenses, and this probably occurred 5 years ago. I started to see it more and more. Recognition of scaling costs. They understood they had to pay more if they were using more, and it impacted the bottom line. So IT was probably allocated a certain percentage of revenue, and they were probably taking more of a percentage than I think the board of directors and the investors thought they were taking, based on the fact they underestimated the impact of cloud costs. And so that drove stage four, which is the evaluation, detailed cost-benefit analysis, assessment of alternatives, including on-prem, and they did the ROI calculations for the different approaches. So GEICO didn't call this out specifically in the article, and the article is just written by somebody telling the story to a reporter, and they're writing that, and that's where I got my information from. But assuming they did the ROI cost, total cost of ownership, what they have now and what are the alternatives on-prem, probably moving it to different cloud providers, microclouds, colo versus managed service providers, and they came up with a solution which was going to be the most cost-effective for them. And then stage five, where they are now, with repatriation, strategic workload assessment, hybrid approach considerations. In other words, this, by the way, is almost never going to be everything moves off the cloud and moves on-prem. It's not binary like that. So there's going to be workloads that do move off the cloud in sequence, but some workloads and some data is likely to be left on the public cloud provider, so you have to operate it in a hybrid configuration. They probably just moved the workloads off of the cloud providers that were generating the highest bills. Smart. So they had to deal with hybrid approach, implementations of on-premise solutions, so get into the cultural differences. And chances are GEICO, don't know for sure, they had some on-prem stuff that was already there. In other words, they're always running their own infrastructure. If 80% of the workloads were in cloud, then the other stuff was typically going to be run on-prem. And I assume that's including some of their SaaS deployments as well, use of Salesforce, common accounting systems, things like that. So this is the stages that you go through, I think that companies are going through kind of as a common pattern. So again, they go through stage one, which is adoption, stage two, which is growth, stage three, which is cost realization. They realize this costs too much than we thought it was going to be. Stage four, evaluation. Stage five, repatriation, basically putting it back on another platform, not necessarily on-prem, but it's on-prem probably 9 times out of 10. And so this is GEICO's journey, but I'm seeing this story told over and over again. And again, most of the companies are going to go public with that, but I'm seeing it's kind of my anecdotal information experiences as a consultant over the last, 10 years as to this being, kind of a common pattern we're going to see over and over again. So we're going to see more GEICOs. We're going to see more stories like this. And I'll report them here. But again, you have to kind of look at them with the heart of an architect. In other words, understand that this is not an emotional decision to move off a public cloud provider, but this is a logical decision based on what that public cloud provider was charging you in terms of cost. So by all accounts, based on what I read in the article, again, this was a huge success for GEICO. GEICO is the right size company that's going to benefit for something like this. In other words, they're large enough to be able to benefit from the economies of scale and moving it from cloud to on-prem, but they're not this major, Fortune 5 company, which is going to absorb lots of other risks, is going to have lots of people who are monitoring what they do. I think GEICO may be a private company. I didn't look. You guys can look yourself. So they're not necessarily set up for the scrutiny I think that it would be. So industry implications would be, I think other insurance providers are going to look at this as an opportunity for them. In other words, are they going to make money in doing this? Again, looking at GEICO's journey, which they're going public with, which is awesome for us because we're able to learn through their journey. And this is going to impact enterprise cloud strategies. And again, keep in mind, cloud works well for what it does. You have to understand the workloads moving to cloud. And where the mistakes are being made is that people are not necessarily putting the right analysis, planning, and architecture around moving these workloads in the cloud, just by the fact they're not understanding that this 2.5 times what they paid is going to come up and hit them. So by not understanding, they're just going blindly into a platform. They really didn't understand what the costs were going to be. And so that's why many are hitting the reset button. I suspect we'll see more of these as well, and I'll report them here. Well, that's all I have for this week. Just back from LinkedIn Learning, recorded some courses out there. So have a great time with those guys, and check out my LinkedIn Learning courses. I think it's 125 courses out there, even considering the translations. Working with those guys for 10 years, I have a great amount of fun with them, and the students are happy that the content's out there. Please check that out. Also, don't forget my fully mentored long-form training course out on Go Cloud Careers, where we go through the ins and outs of generative AI architecture. It's not just throwing videos at you, and this is basically walking you through a project, how you learn by doing deliverables, reviewing deliverables, and all that kind of stuff, which is the hard part of it. But it's what you need to know to be a successful architect in general, cloud architect, security architect. But in this case, we're focused on generative AI. And as you know, that's a big trend right now. Also, don't forget my InfoWorld blog and my other stuff. Follow me on LinkedIn and see my other content as it flies by. Don't forget to check out my other podcast, AI Insights and Innovation, out on the Cube, and let's keep going. So happy to have you here. Thank you very much for listening to this show. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys in a week. Bye.